Hello, everyone. Welcome to the ground school that we're offering through EAA Chapter 1641 in Bloomsburg, PA. So, I wanted to, first of all, talk a little bit about these videos that I'm going to produce and what they are, what they aren't. These are videos to supplement our Rod Machado book that we're using for the ground school. And like most things in aviation, the Rod Machado book is airplane focused. Helicopters and other rotorcraft tend to be second class citizens in some people's minds in the aviation world, even though, they're the coolest kind of aircraft out there. So what I'm doing is, in addition to going through the Rod Machado book, I am going to go through this book, the Helicopter Flying Handbook. And this is available for free. Go to the FAA website. You can download it. You can get it electronically. You can get a print copy as well. And it's a really good book. So what am I going to go through in this book? I'm going to go through things that are different, right? So the Helicopter Flying Handbook, if you look at the table of contents here, you're going to see some of this stuff is similar to what you would expect in any kind of aircraft flying handbook. And if I look at the table of contents, introduction to the helicopter, which is what I'm going to talk about in this video, aerodynamics of flight. Yes, some of that's different from airplanes to helicopters, but what's not different? Airspace. Airspace is the same. Weather is the same. So there's a lot of commonalities. So, for those of you in the ground school who are also considering helicopters, maybe even not right away, maybe it's an eventual kind of thing that you're looking to do, that's what these videos are about. I do have some videos on my YouTube channel that go through some specific helicopter things, like how do I do this in a helicopter? How do I do that in a helicopter? How do I do this in a Schweitzer S300 CBI, which is what I use to train other pilots to become helicopter pilots. So you can look for those kinds of videos. That's not what we're going to be talking about in these videos. These videos are going to be kind of like the videos that I have for Rod Machado's book, where I'm going to just say, hey, here's to me the highlights of each chapter. Okay, so I'm not going to read the chapter to you. I'm just going to, talk to a little bit about what is in these various chapters. So this video is for chapter 1, which is all about helicopters. So what is a helicopter? It's this cool aircraft that can hover. It can take off and land vertically. And you can do all kinds of cool things in a helicopter. I like to say, if you want to just get somewhere, take an airplane. They're a little bit faster. But if you want to see stuff and enjoy the trip along the way, take a helicopter. If you fly in an airplane and you're trying to point something out to someone on the ground and you're on opposite sides of the plane, usually it's, hey, do you see that over there? Nope, don't see it. In a helicopter, usually you can see everything. That's why they're used for things like sightseeing. Of course, a helicopter is great because you can bring a helicopter into a very tight space. If you look at the statistics, if your engine quits in a helicopter, you're better off than in an airplane. And you might think, well, why is that? Well, for one thing, you can bring a helicopter down into a space about the size of the helicopter. If you have a 30 by 30 space, you can land a helicopter in that. I used to have the dream that many pilots have of, having my own little strip and, place in the country. my dream is a little bit modified now, where I still wouldn't mind that place in the country, but I don't need all the real estate for a landing strip. I need a 30 by 30 spot. And honestly, the savings and the real estate cost between buying all that property for a runway versus having a 30 by 30 pad for my helicopter just bought me that helicopter. So if you look at a helicopter, it's got different parts, and that's a lot of what this chapter is about. You have your main rotor, which has blades, and then there's a hub, and they're attached to this hub, and then there's some sort of a mast. And that mast is what spins and gives you the rotation for the helicopters. Again, you can put them down most anywhere, makes it very useful. It took a while for them to develop helicopters. It turns out there's actually a lot of rotorcraft history in this area in eastern Pennsylvania. If you go down to Westchester at the Brandywine Airport, you will find the American Helicopter Museum. It's a really cool place. I'd recommend you visit there at least once. And you'll find there was a lot of things going on with rotorcraft, gyroplanes, and then later helicopters in this part of Pennsylvania, which I didn't know before I moved here. So you got guys like Sikorsky, who developed a helicopter back in the 40s. And then eventually, a little bit later in the 50s, they started putting turbine engines in the helicopters. And why turbine engines? Well, because they're more reliable. Not that the piston engines are unreliable that we have today, but the turbine engines are even more reliable. So if you look at many commercial helicopters, they're going to be powered by turbine engines, and sometimes two turbine engines. That way, if one of them does fail, they still have another one. Of course, that's pretty expensive. So for training helicopters, we typically might have piston engines. If you train in a Schweitzer or a Robinson, or, even one of those fancy new French Cabris, it's going to have a piston engine in it. You fly something like a Bell Jet Ranger, well, it's going to have a jet engine in it. That's why it's called a Jet Ranger. You can do all kinds of fun things. You can land on little bitty platforms at the top of a ridge. Can't do that with an airplane. So if you look at a helicopter and how they're used, they're frequently used for things that you just can't do with an airplane. Some things you can kind of do with an airplane. You might notice some helicopters sometimes spraying crops. Yeah, you can do it with a plane. You can get it in a lot tighter spaces more safely with a helicopter, though. In many cases, they use helicopters where they can't use planes because helicopters are more expensive. They're more expensive to buy and more expensive to operate just because of the nature of things. They have a lot more moving parts. So looking at your helicopter, you have things like this sky crane, it's lifting a whole house. You've got firefighting helicopters getting water. Of course, you have medical evacuation helicopters. So what are the basic components? We already said you've got your rotor blades. You're going to have 2 to 5 typically of these things. And they're connected to the mast, the part that spins, by a hub. Now, there are different configurations for rotorcraft. It is very common to have a single main rotor and then a tail rotor that works against the torque of having the main rotor up top, so that, if you look at any movie or TV show where a helicopter crashes, it starts spinning uncontrollably first and then it crashes. So you have to counteract that torque with a tail rotor, unless you have something like this where you've got two rotors, or you can have coaxial rotors like this guy here, and they each spin opposite directions, so you don't need a tail rotor anymore because they counteract each other. So Sikorsky kind of started out using the tail rotor design, which is still present in many helicopters today. Now, how do you control a helicopter? We have different flight controls. We have the cyclic. The cyclic is the stick that's typically in front of the pilot, and this is used to tilt the rotor disc. If you push forward on the stick, it tilts the disc forward and you go forward. If you pull back on the stick, then it tilts the rotor back and you slow down or eventually start flying backwards. We have the collective. The collective is a lever that is to the left of the pilot. When you raise the collective, it increases the pitch of the rotor blades and it makes you go up. Typically, it's also correlated with the throttle. We'll get to that here in a little bit. So that when you pull up, it will increase the throttle so that you can produce more power in the engine to get the thrust that you need. And then we have the anti-torque pedals. If they were in an airplane, they would be called rudder pedals. They work exactly like rudder pedals in the plane. So if you want to yaw the aircraft to the left, you press the left pedal. If you want to yaw it to the right, you press the right pedal. Just like what you're going to have with an airplane. So if you're hover taxiing, which is taxiing just a foot or two above the ground, and you're trying to make a turn, you can make what they call a pedal turn, and you basically just push the pedal and you turn the helicopter, as opposed to tilting the helicopter like you would in flight. And then the throttle. So again, the cyclic is going to be typically a stick. Now, there are a few helicopters that have a different control, like the Robinson helicopters have this little tilting bar, a T-bar. But a traditional helicopter has just a stick in front of the pilot. So what happens is, as I said, this will tilt the rotor. Well, how does it do that? It moves something called a swash plate. So typically you'll have a stationary swash plate that is connected down here. It's not shown in this picture. And then on top of that, there will be a rotating swash plate, which is connected via rods to the rotor blades. So if this plate tilts, it's going to tilt this rotor as those blades spin around. It's really that simple. It's called a cyclic because it varies the pitch of the blades as it goes through a cycle. And then we have our collective. So what does the collective do? The collective is just used to change the pitch of all the blades by the same amount simultaneously. So if you look at what happens when you raise the collective lever in a typical helicopter, it's going to raise this plate, which increases the pitch on all of these rotor blades. Anti-torque pedals are going to be connected to our tail rotor. So here's a tail rotor. And we have these pitch change links. So as I push the pedals, it's going to increase or decrease the thrust from this tail rotor. So this tail rotor is attached to the left side of the tail. So if I have thrust, it pushes the tail to the right, and the nose goes to the left. Now, unlike airplanes, which typically have left turning tendencies, U.S. helicopters have right turning tendencies, because as viewed from above, the rotor goes counterclockwise. So since the rotor goes counterclockwise, the helicopter tries to spin clockwise, or the nose goes to the right in that system. You do have some helicopters where the rotor spins the wrong way, some European helicopters, some home-built helicopters. So just like airplanes, you can have right turning tendencies if your prop turns the wrong way. So this is how we turn on the ground. This is also how we counteract any right turning tendencies of the helicopter. Again, just like you steer an airplane on the ground with your feet, you steer your helicopter in a hover taxi with your feet. Same thing. The throttle. Typical piston helicopters have a twist grip throttle. So as you twist it up from the perspective of the pilot, that increases the throttle. And there's a linkage, and that goes into the engine. Now, many helicopters will have a correlator so that as you pull the collective up, it automatically increases this throttle. Because the assumption is if you're pulling the collective up, you needed some more power, right? You're trying to raise the helicopter. It's kind of like the elevator control, if you will. You want to go up, you pull the collective up. You want to go down, you drop the collective. It's not quite that simple, because nothing is simple with helicopters, but that is the basics of how the collective works. There are some helicopters that have a governor. So you basically just twist in full throttle, and then it keeps the RPMs within appropriate limits. So the Robinson helicopters would be an example of such a helicopter. And we'll talk a little bit more in some later chapters. There are two basic ways of being in flight in a helicopter. You're either hovering or you're going forward. Now, it's true that you could go backwards, but, let's not go there just yet. Hovering is one of the most challenging parts about flying a helicopter. It's part of the reason that I like it. It's a lot more challenging than flying an airplane, especially hovering. It's something that if you added on a helicopter license, even after flying an airplane for many hours, it takes a little bit getting used to, because it's a very different experience. But it's a very rewarding thing, once you get it right. And that is pretty much the first chapter from this book. Again, I'm not going to just read you guys these chapters, and there's ample opportunity during our Q&A sessions for you to ask questions. So that is it for chapter 1. Thanks for tuning in, and we will see you in class.